Okay, thank you very much. This session is on legal and organisational aspects of data interoperability, climate adaptation case studies, and perhaps others. I'll start with the acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and we pay our respect to their elders past and present. Now, I'm going to say a few words just to introduce and frame the session, and then I'll hand over to Matti. The thinking about this session came because Matti and I involved with CoData on a European Commission-funded project called Climate Adapt for EOSC. One of the things, among others, that project is trying to do is to address issues of legal and organisational interoperability. This is a topic area which has become increasingly of interest to projects and institutions in Europe because of initiatives like the European Open Science Cloud and efforts to help organisations contribute their data to that initiative, to share their data through that initiative, etc. So how do we make that easier from various perspectives? A few years ago, a document was written and published, called the EOSC Interoperability Framework. And it's useful to a point. It breaks down the problem space, and it does a job of classification. And when you have that classification, then you can start thinking about what we need to do in each of those modes of interoperability. It talks about lots of interoperability. It doesn't quite use that acronym that came along after, but it talks about legal, organisational, technical, and semantic interoperability. And so the genesis of this session was that we wanted to start a conversation with organisations and initiatives in other geographies to help us understand and to feed in ideas to that work that we're doing, and of course to share that work. Now, we find ourselves in that project perhaps in a place that we don't yet have an awful lot to say about the work that we're doing. We're doing a landscape analysis at the moment, and we can divulge some of our initial findings, but so we can't sort of bring an awful lot to the table beyond what you'll see. But we're hoping that this session will act as a catalyst. We can share some initial ideas and establish some ongoing conversations, which will be useful, of course, for us, because we're self-interested and we want help understanding the problem space from the perspective of that project. But I hope for colleagues in Australia and elsewhere who are also tackling this issue of how do we unravel some of the challenges in relation to legal and organisational interoperability. You'll note that I've not used any definitions of those things yet because that will come in due course. But I hope what I've just said helps understand the objectives of the session, that it's a conversation starter, that we want to know where you are, and we'll say a little bit about where we are. Before I hand over to Matti, who'll continue that introduction, I want to give a big vote of thanks to Lesley, who has helped corral and organise this session. We proposed it some time ago, and then, life, business, occupation, whatever, Lesley was getting a bit concerned that we hadn't done enough to pull the session together. So, although we're standing here at the front, a lot of the thanks in organising this and making it what I hope will be something of great interest goes to Lesley. So, with no further ado, I'll hand over to Matti, who'll give a nice little presentation.
Okay, so thank you. We thought that it would be actually useful to start this framing of the legal and organizational interoperability with a couple of case studies. So one of these sort of more day-to-day life example of organizational and legal interoperability. So the first glance might look like this. So here we have two organizations which are known as households with dogs. They have sent out their sort of task force to look into the inter-organizational collaboration opportunities. So there is a kind of a handshake process going on, and depending on whether you're a dog owner or how confident dog owner you are, you might think that, okay, they are having great fun, but obviously there was some motivation to do this. And so the legal interoperability issues that makes this possible. So we have defined obligations and liability of the organization, i.e. the dog owners, that what they can and what they shouldn't do. We have specifications of RFID tags, there's passports and so on, vaccination requirements and things like that. Then also the organizational interoperability. We have dog parks usually. So basically, how do you find them, how they are signposted? Then there's the etiquette in a way. Depending on the country, you're kind of supposed to ask the people already inside the fence that is it okay if I bring my dog in, and so on. But then beyond these legal and organizational interoperability issues, we have what I like to call the hidden enablers. We have the cultural norm. Dogs are expected to be able to run free and socialize. We have the political will of zoning these things, and there's a trust. Usually we assume that no aggressive dogs are brought into the park, at least intentionally. Also the incentives in a way, the owners get out of the house and maybe even socialize with the other owners. So just to basically to illustrate that the legal and organizational interoperability solutions, they need complemented things like a political will and trust, governance framework and things like this. And without these hidden enablers, the interoperability will look like the first glance that, okay, are they biting each other and so on. So you might actually decide that, okay, the dog will be fine staying at home, going in the yard. And in a way, addressing these issues, you might not get a better RFID chip will not get dogs into the dog park. So you need to be a little bit realistic there. So then getting a little bit closer to the topic of the climate adaptation. So in this project, the hidden enablers, I think they are generally solid and well balanced. So there's a collaboration across the sectors. So there's companies, academia, parts of the civil protection and so on. They have been working on quite a long while. They have established a trust. And then, of course, all of them are covered by the European interoperability framework. So there is essentially the fence around the park saying that, okay, this is more or less the area where we play. I think legal issues, they are quite, at the moment, they are hidden by these well-aligned business processes because they have co-evolved. So people don't day-to-day, they don't look into okay, what did the SLA say? What is the legal agreement and IPR? So it's more or less tacitly understood that, okay, this is the way we work. So I think the difficulty in a way is preparing for shake-ups because these pilot cases, they will be expanded, they will be developed further, they will actually be moved into different legal frameworks, into the settings where you don't have the organizational trust in place. All of this will need to be onboarded into commons. So in this case, it will be the European Open Science Cloud and potentially European Common Data Spaces. So concretely, the things that we are looking into, there is security issues. So we need to have information about critical infrastructure, so bridges and so on in some of these cases. Privacy comes into place quite often. Then because we have a commercial players in, you might have the contract law and so on. Formalizing this thing that, okay, which is understood that, okay, these people will do this for us, formalizing this as an SLA, operational level agreement, or an MOU, this is something that we need to look into. And in general, integrating resources across different resource pool that will actually change because the local data sources will be different than when we are expanding. And of course, we want to describe these issues in a semantically complete and coherent way. So we need to have frameworks like CDIF, DUO, and so on, in a way to develop this vocabulary and more or less that what are the activities that we do with the data and resources to enable this overall service so that we can then take it further into other settings. So final slide to sort of go into a little bit more detail about, so we have 3 use cases. The first one actually will be described in more detail by Thanasis at the end of this session. So this urban heat island, how we deal with that. And here, the scales of data, they come from planet size to individual. So we have this personal data, vulnerable populations and so on. So how we do things like informed consent and so on in different settings. Use case 2, it's coastal or estuary hazards, and here we have essentially balancing act. We need to have the protection of environment and protection of supply chains. They might actually be in a little bit of a conflict, and then you bring in trade secrets. So if you have logistics company bringing containers through your port, they might not want to share the data with their competitors. And finally, the third one, which is dealing with the shrinking and swelling of clay soils. And here, I think Simon is especially happy to hear that France is in forefront in terms of collecting systematically nation-level information at what are the damages caused by this phenomenon. So I think it's average €1 billion per year. And in France, they have comprehensive statistics because they have, let's say, the national approach for insuring against this risk. So what happens when this use case will be actually replicated in an environment where you don't have this data? So I think that will be one of the interesting challenges. So with this, I would hand back to Simon, who will then talk about some of the tools that we will be using to address these challenges. So.
Thank you very much, Matti. And I think I'll pause a little bit more on this slide. I hope you can see, I mean, we find these three very fascinating use cases. One's of considerable importance. We've been working with them and digging into their data, trying to understand what legal and organisational issues may arise. As Matti has stressed, because there's this vision of creating replicants, is that the word? Replicators. That will be an interesting step where prior to that step, we will need to have addressed some of the legal and organisational issues. In the urban heat one, a lot of it is public data, but they will be running, they will have some individual data, they will have some identifiable urban environment data, which may be disclosive, they will have some focus group data. With the coastal estuary hazards, in particular overtopping, there is some IP that's held by the research group on their modelling, which they're concerned to ensure is recognised. And there is also some sensitive data held by the Port Authority about the particular buildings, etc., so with security issues, as I think Matti touched on. Shrink swell is interesting. Again, it's largely, well, it's interesting because the French can't say shrink swell, which is but it's a fascinating case study. It's largely public data, but we're working with a private company called Artelia, who want, on the one hand, to produce a freely accessible public version, and then a paid-for version with more data in it. And so we've got to manage the relationship between those two things, some of their IP as well. So hopefully that gives an idea of the of some of the challenges. Right, after that nice set of slides from Matti, there's some boring text from me, because this is really for reference. Okay, but I don't like to get into these sort of discussions without at least sharing some definitions. There has been a certain amount of thinking in European projects about legal interoperability in the last little while, but I'm not convinced that they've pushed the definitional side of things much further than that 2016 report, which was a joint CODATA RDA report. And you can see our dreadful 1970s logo there, which, thank goodness, we've changed. But I don't think I should read this out, but it's there for reference. But I think it's a very elegantly written and useful definition. It does focus, however, on licenses. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to move beyond licenses as part of the legal obligations. But it's a very good starting point for thinking about what legal interoperability is. So that's there for reference. Likewise, organisational interoperability. There's been a certain amount of work in European projects and elsewhere, but I don't find a better one than the one that appeared in the EOSC interoperability framework. And it is always notable when you go digging into these things how particular definitions are recycled from report to report to report. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if the definition is a good one, but it does suggest that thinking has not moved forward a great deal. Maybe it doesn't need to. So on the one hand, we have, as Matti has said, how do we respond to legal requirements and licenses? On the other hand, how do we respond to specific agreements between and among organisations? Now, I'll end this sort of opening section with really a description of our methodology. And perhaps this is an area where at the end we can have some discussion and some feedback. But this is what we're setting out to do in this project. By the end of the year, we need to produce a scoping report which will lay out the state of the art, and we're continuing that literature survey of what has been written about legal and organisational interoperability. In that analysis, we want to try and list the commonly encountered restrictions, conditions, obligations, and try to point to enablers. By enablers, I mean precisely those licenses or agreements among organisations that say, yes, we can enable the data sharing, notwithstanding these particular restrictions. We have already done the work on modelling the data flows of understanding what data needs to be accumulated in the case studies. We've done a certain amount of the work identifying the obstacles and enablers, and that will be published. And then this next step, which I think is really important, is how do we characterise those? How do we make that working list? And how do we understand how in principle these can be modelled and described using the standards that are listed there, the data privacy vocabulary, the open digital rights language, and the data use ontology. I'm particularly interested in the application of the data use ontology because it has precisely these sort of conditions and obligations. It certainly doesn't currently have all the conditions and obligations that we would be concerned with in this project. But it does have some which we can see how they would be applicable. Geographical restrictions, institutional specific restrictions, because we have an agreement with this organisation or not. But above all, somewhere along there, collaboration required. So you may use these data so long as you undertake to collaborate with us in the future. I find that a very interesting obligation and enabler. Non-commercial, etc., these sort of things. And one of the things we need to dig in, we won't be able to do this by the end of the year, but the work that goes forward with those case studies is understanding what sort of conditions, obligations, and enablers they need to have listed in their agreements that can then be articulated in the metadata around the data itself or about the data product, so that any end user knows what conditions apply to the use of those data. So we will publish that scoping report and that discussion of the methodology and our task by the end of the year, and then we have a further 2 years to create a system that implements that for each of those case studies and for the replicators. So watch this space, but I hope in the subsequent discussions we'll hear from analogous or similar work elsewhere, and we might identify points of contact that we can collaborate on and make sure that this is not just a European thing, but a global thing. Okay, so just let me remind myself of the agenda. So we're now going to have a set of quick talks from various initiatives talking about how they're encountering and tackling legal and organisational interoperability issues. These will be quick 6-minute contributions. First we have Kieran, then Adrian, then Pascal. We were going to have Hilde, but I'm not sure that she's online, unless someone corrects me to that. No. So we've got a video from Shaily Gandhi. We have Thanasis, who's involved with one of the case studies, leading one of the case studies. And then we have Rebecca and Kelsey. So we'll rattle through that. I hope that will be dynamic and interesting, and I'll stop using up all the time and hand over to Kieran.
Thank you, Simon. I'm going to probably skip the first couple of slides because everyone by now have heard about ARDC. But Planet ARDC is one of the thematic data commons within ARDC, and the goal of that is to look at the national scale data infrastructure for Earth and environment and try to build what's in there. So I'm going to talk about the perspective from that. Again, it's got 4 sort of themes along with it that we work on, and as we're going through this, the legal and organizational dynamics really play out really strongly. So in Australia, we have a fairly complex jurisdictional, legal landscape. We've got 9 jurisdictions, a state and a federal, at the state and a federal level. And when we start to look at the legal side of it, when we need to look to work out how it applies to a data, it becomes that you need to work out what laws are applied at the federal level, but then triggers the state level. And in many respects in Australia, the way it works is that you'll have very sectoral legislation as well that comes into play. So it's not privacy, but then privacy in environmental or privacy in health. So they're all sort of mixed up. So it becomes quite complicated that way. That's a list of the environmental protection acts that we have. So each one gets triggered depending on what you're doing in this space. And then when you try to work out how to share, whether we should share something or not, it kind of becomes an n-squared problem space, because for each legislation clause, you got to work out whether what other state one applies or the federal ones apply, and then across different sectoral, different domain-specific legislation in there as well. So the challenge ends up being for the person who has to actually decide whether we should share it or not. It's very, very hard to do that, especially when they're not an illegal expert as well, right? So the risk for them making that decision to share becomes very high. Obvious answer, let's not share it. So switching to the organizational side of it, that's a mapping that I had done some years ago around for each jurisdiction, around the data sharing and legislation that's there, and the different decision-making structures that are there in each of the jurisdictions in Australia. As you can see, there are quite a bit of variation across these things. And so on top of the legal side, when you need to actually start to look at sharing across these ones, you then come into different organizational structures, different decision-making structures, different policies, and all of this. So all in all, it becomes a very, very complex problem. I'm not coming with answers here, but just saying that's the problem space we're dealing with. And it continues to be challenging for us. So all these initiatives that are happening to try and understand this, unpack this, is going to be really, really helpful. One of the solutions we are exploring is the data spaces. So as we see the world with the data becoming more and more complex and the number of players becoming increasingly, number of data providers and suppliers and consumers increasing, what data spaces seems to do is flip the problem into a federated network rather than trying to bring it together. And therefore, you're not trying to solve it for all of these things, but for a particular use case, you can say, well, that applies to one jurisdiction, to one domain, and therefore that becomes a little bit easier to deal. And that's what it seems to provide. So to be tested, but that's sort of one of the options that we're trying to explore here. And I think that's where we're going to stop. Don't need that slide. Thank you.
Yeah, that was perfect. I'm sorry, I was troubleshooting something. Next up is Adrian, if I remember the running order correctly.
All right, 6 minutes. Those of you who know me, 6 minutes is where I start to take my first breath, and there's a comma. Let's get moving. I was asked to give a little bit of a different perspective from the healthcare and health research sector to same problem, but a different perspective. Healthcare interoperability is quite formal and very well developed when you arrive at your GP. The bottom level is foundational. That GP can send a message to the pathology people who did your blood test. So that's pretty well sorted out. The internet can do that. The second level, what on earth, how is it packaged? What is it standard? There is very formal standards called FHIR for messaging, for actually making sure that the structure arrives from the GP to the pathology lab. Now that the message has been delivered at level 2, in level 3, is it intelligible? Can the pathology lab actually understand where it, what it means, diabetes type 2 or paracetamol, but how much paracetamol? There's a very formal ontology, SNOMED, and ICD-10, etc., that allows you to make sure that the message that has been sent through the structure at level 2 is now mutually intelligible. The next thing is, okay, what's the organisation going to do with it? So that's, now that I have it, do I know what the pathology lab does? Do they treat it with privacy that I was expecting it? Do they have the same business? Do I understand their business processes? Am I going to get a telephone call back from them, etc.? So there's a whole set of other organisational things that fit on top for you to have a very seamless experience when you arrive at your general practitioner. So this is for healthcare operations, and we leverage the same standards for healthcare research. I'm from the People Research Data Commons, which is the counterpart of the Planet that you just talked about. Thank you for the extra 30 seconds there, Kieran. I'm just going to give you an example of one of the services that we operate and how these things play out. Health Data Australia is a national portal to discover and request clinical trial data from around Australia. This is how it works. Do I have a pointer? Oh, well, okay. The top left-hand corner, data provider. Someone has some clinical trial data, they register it, can you see it, the next step with the Australian New Zealand Clinical Trials Register. They also register a data set with DataCite, so that's the very top level there. That feeds down into Health Data Australia, so that's how we create a record. Then the next step starts at the, actually I've got one of these, do I? Yeah, okay, so then we just went across here, down, and now we've got Health Data Australia that's been created out of that. The data user then arrives and they can search the catalogue and requests. The data request goes back to the data provider again, and then if it's accepted, then the data is shared securely and ethically back here. So that's how the system works. So what does interoperability mean in that context? There is a lot of technical interoperability there. See, the very top one, there are API calls from those registers that come in on a nightly basis, just say, are there any new data sets? Are there any new clinical trials? Happens at the speed of light. The next one, we have federated search here. So when you search on our thing, we also send a query off to the UK and they say, have you got any data sets about rare cancers there, because we have a query. So that's again another interoperable federated search. Data request. I'm not going to spend any more time on this because this is not what we're talking about. This is the technical interoperability. But to make a system, so information and data can go around there at the speed of fibre optic cables. But it was a fabulous quote on the first day that said, actually, data travels at the speed of trust. So that's all the organisational interoperability that we need around this system. So I'll go through a couple of these. The first one is the data provider. Did this organisation collect the data with valid consent? So if I'm a data user organisation, I need to understand the business processes of the people who collected the data in the first place. Did they ask for consent, etc.? And so that's an organisational interoperability. then once we get through to a request has gone, the second one here is, how does the custodian decide to approve these requests? So I'm now a requester, I've made a request to another organisation. Does that organisation even have a governance? Does it have a workflow? Will my request just sit there for 2 years, which happens in the healthcare area, because nobody has a governance policy capability to even answer the question? Okay. Will the data be used legally and ethically by the data user? So that's what are the policies of the organisation of the data user? Are they going to use it carefully? That's what the data provider needs to know about the data user organisation. So that's, again, an organisational understanding. What are the business processes of the research organisation? And then well, I won't even do that last one. So I'll give you one then small example here. The very first question that I had there, very first question we had at the top there, does the organisation collect the data with valid consent? How did we attack that? We did a massive project that had surveys and consultation, refinement, beta testing for a patient information and consent form template to be used with every clinical trial in Australia. And we now actually have a standard set of words that are used in the patient information consent form that says, I can't even read them there, but we are going to use your research, this data for other kinds of research. And once we've got that that's set up now in the national templates, it actually goes back to the legal mandate to be able to even share health data, because it's against the law to share any health data unless you have these kind of things in place. And now we have a standard set of templates that starts to feed that organisational trust. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adrian. That was extremely interesting, in particular that standard set of terms. In the area that you're working in, are those sort of terms widely shared? Are there reference works that people look at, or is that very much something that you've put together?
The pyramid slide?
No, the standard set of terms that you were talking about here. Yeah.
Yes, this is now a national template that's back in
Yeah.
if you go to the Research Council of the Health, MRC, the Medical Research Council. If you go to the Medical Research Council, which is the legal body that has to overview the ethical sharing of data in Australia, this is the template that you'll get.
Because I think one of the things that we have to do as a community is share those definitions and terms so that they can be encoded and put into practice. And obviously they will vary across legal jurisdictions, the precise terminology needed, but I think we can learn from each other a great deal by sharing that sort of knowledge. That's fantastic. Adrian, can I ask Pascal, I think is the next speaker.
Thank you. Okay, are you using this one the right way? Oops, that's not me. Oh, that's me. Okay. I'm Pascal Perez, director of Orten. Pleased to meet you all. Pleased to meet you all. Can you hear me? Yes. Very briefly, Orten, we're a national research infrastructure facility like ARDC and others, funded by the Australian government. Our mandate is very simple. We have to serve the whole urban research community around Australia in 3 ways: providing hard-to-get data, supporting hard-to-do implementations, and contributing to workforce upskilling, very often in collaboration with our colleagues from ARDC. The challenges we face when we talk about urban research in Australia, but I think you can generalize to the whole world. There's a large amount of existing data. So our problem is not that we lack data. There's too much data, I would say. But most of this data is siloed, and many of these silos are hidden to researchers. Why? Partly because there's high-value commercial data sets, which is probably the majority of data you can get from cities out there, and you have to pay for it. But also on the public sector side, the data, which is really the high-value data for researchers nowadays, is what's called the sensitive data at large, and I refer back to Adrian's presentation. So how do we deal with all that? Well, first we try to define, as a research infrastructure facility, big domains of research we want to support. And there's no surprise there. What we support over our 5 years plan is impact of climate change, energy transition, and demographic transformation on cities, infrastructure systems, and local communities. And this is our daily landscape in terms of data. So we have to deal with private sector, as I mentioned, public sector, and academia. Private sector on the lower left-hand side for me. You've got primary data that has a commercial value from the onset. So you have to negotiate monetary value. There's also commercial in confidence contractual aspects you need to deal with from the onset. And finally, if you manage to get this data, these providers will wait for the derived data product you're going to create with researchers and see whether there's a commercial value, and then you have to negotiate. That's what you have to deal with. At the top, you've got the academic world. Academic world is very simple, and I'm overstating here, so sorry to my colleagues. Data has to be open, free, being shareable with anybody. But by the way, if we create a derived product, we'd like to keep the ownership of it, try to make money with it, but we won't guarantee SLA. Sorry, I'm overstating. The public sector side, it's an interesting one, because for us as a national research infrastructure, this is where impact is, policy, intervention, assessments, in the context of climate adaptation, for example. But also they provide data, as I mentioned, sensitive data. So you've got a mix of interest and total paranoia. Paranoia because of the Privacy Act, rightfully so, but also about data probity. And I won't dwell into it because I'll come back to it at the end of my presentation from a meeting I had yesterday in Sydney. The way we deal with that as a National Research Infrastructure Facility is first to set up the scene. We start with challenges, well-identified challenges with all our partners, and we try to define solutions together. And the way we interact with all the parties is through a nested process where we've got the innovation ecosystem, which is the large circle, and then at the core of it, which is more what Orten core team is doing, is the enabling platform. Think about from our Australian colleagues here, the Bunnings. When you go to Bunnings, you've got this Makita or Ryobi, or sorry, I should not name brands, but it doesn't matter, where you've got the same battery for all the tools, okay? This is a standardization. So that's what we try to do with the system, not having people repeating the same thing again and again and again, and that's why we invest our time and money as a national research infrastructure. So that's just setting the scene. It's not enough. Then we need to engage with private sector, public sector, and even technology providers if needed. And this is what we define now as our sandbox process, where we try to convince one use case at a time, data providers, technology providers, research and innovation providers to look at the use case, define a challenge, try to solve the challenge. From a POC to a proof of concept to a minimum viable product, whatever the product is. And then thinking distribution of this product, whether it's free or not, doesn't matter. We need to make sure this product will live the day after the end of the project. And we don't want to repeat the same thing again and again and again and again with the private sector, public sector, and academia. So what we've put in place, and it's just a start, but we've got a couple of these contracts in place now. On one side, you've got academic nodes with whom we've got multi-year agreements of collaboration and partnership, and where we put cash and in-kind support, like many other increased facilities, and the universities have to do the same on their side. But on the private sector side, the interesting part is the fact that the contract we have with the data providers is, again, multi-annual contracts, and they're waiting for the use cases to reach the sandbox. So we don't have to renegotiate the contract again and again and again. I'll leave you reading this slide about why data space is becoming an essential aspect of what we're going to continue to build upon over the next couple of years. But I'm going back to my anecdote from yesterday in Sydney. There was a big telco company, Australian one I won't name, in the room. There was the Department of Transport, New South Wales, in the room, and us, 8 people. And it was about creating new origin destination matrices for Australia, and for New South Wales first, but Australia. but also location insights for heat island effects in cities. The first two things we hit the wall about after an hour was where the data will be, on your side or our side. I said, but can we just figure out why we want to share the data, at which level, so how, and what kind of data we want to share. And then they started to relax. The second thing was, oh, there's a risk. I say, what risk? Who's going to bear the risk? What's the level of risk? And so that's where probity comes back and these kind of things. But this is where trust has been mentioned a couple of times already. This is the key for me. From a technology perspective, I don't see any issue implementing what we have in mind. It's just about this first step. And guess what? Out of 8 people in the room, 4 were technical people, 4 were not technical people. The people who were talking about risk, they were the non-technical people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pascal. And I think there's a really important point there at the end, which is that you can make things a lot easier sometimes by drilling down into the detail and understanding the specifics of what data needs to be shared in what circumstances and building agreements about that. Certainly that's the approach that we're trying to take in Climate Adapt, to understand those specific restrictions and how we can overcome them. We haven't been able to get Hilde online yet. If we met, she has got the Zoom link. Right. Hilde, are you online?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Yes. Okay, great. We got you on in time. So you should be able to see your slides, or do you want to share your slides from there? Okay. In the interest of time, why don't you just start your presentation and tell me to click through when, next slide, please, sort of thing.
Thank you very much, Simon. So I'm going to talk about organizational interoperability in a project called So Green, or the social aspects of the green transition. Next slide, please. Yeah, the So Green, the purpose of that is really to integrate Europe leading social survey infrastructures to really support fair and inclusive green transition policies. And it will look into how the green transition impacts generations and socioeconomic groups, and provide insights to what can help to inform policies and make sure that not vulnerable groups are left behind. And by doing that, they are developing instruments, common instruments, and also providing data sets that are enriched with environmental data. And all that to inform policies for the green transitions that are good and fair. And this is funded by Horizon Infra 2024. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here you can see the partners and affiliated entities in this. It is the 4 big leading social survey infrastructure: the European Social Survey, Generation Gender Program, Guide, Growing Up in Digital Europe, and Share, Survey on Health, Aging and Retirement in Europe. And then you can see all the partners that are also involved with data collection and archiving of data and many different other things like competence provision and so on. Next slide, please. And the common goals here. First, the survey infrastructures wanted to define some common concepts, and that is about to focus on the social aspect of public attitudes towards the green transition, and energy and transportation poverty, job security, access to infrastructure, and so on. And then they developed a common instrument module with related questions to have comparable data from that, from all the different surveys. And also they want to integrate that with environmental data, that is climate and air quality, and also some data from OpenStreetMap. And then in the end, a common website for dissemination and learning. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here we can see a kind of organizational interoperability over the life cycle. Here is the generic statistical business process model that is used by statistical agencies very much, but also many of these surveys, they are very thorough in how they go about in the data. And the green circles here are the kind of areas where common things are done over the life cycle for the surveys. So it is to specify the needs, to design output, to build the collection instrument, to integrate data, to derive new variables and units, review and validate, and to update output systems. Next slide, please. So how did this come about? How did this collaboration come about? Of course, the funding helps, the opportunity for funding, but also you have this commonality in practices and from all the different services. They know each other, they know the topic area, and they came together also to do this based on existing work that had been done earlier by some of the partners. And then they asked the affiliated entities you saw in the other slide to contribute to that. So that was a kind of top-down organizational thing from that. Next slide, please. But then, on the other hand, when you're doing this kind of data integration with data from various domains, you really also need some experts from those other domains. So to involve the partners from the environmental side, that was really a peer-to-peer thing, because the big infrastructures didn't think of that. But a network between peers kind of secured that the environmental data partners and also advisory board members came in. And we can now work together and exchange knowledge to get the best kind of methods and data, integrated data out of that. Next slide, please. So here again, you can see many of the steps for the service are the same, but some are identical and some are done in little different ways in the different surveys. Next slide, please. But now, how do the kind of data space thing come in? Because that is not usually in the survey business processes, right? So it is a little on the side. How do we bring them in? Because the data can sometimes be a problem, and the environmental context data to fit with this survey data in time and space, they are not always available. But the kind of big data spaces like Copernicus and so we could do it. But how to make that connection? That is something we really should try to move to. Yeah, get in place some way. And I'm not sure, maybe EOS could be a kind of driver for that, because currently it is a little blocker. Next slide. Okay, so thank you very much. That was all from
Thank you very much, Hilde. And I'm glad that we overcome those issues about access to the meeting. Thanasis, can you hear me?
Yeah, good morning. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay, so thank you very much. And I'd like to express my... Oh, sorry, you cannot see me very well. It's still early morning here. So I'd like to... and I'm not even in Greece. I'm in the middle of the Atlantic, in the Azores, so even worse. So I'm going to just give a bit more context into Simon's presentation about the use case of the climate adapt for EOS, and especially the first one, which is about the urban heat island. And I think an extra interesting part is how we can put together different communities, in the sense that we have people who have the data, people who are the stakeholders like civil protection, like municipalities. But from our perspective, we would like to get the citizens into the whole context. and the citizen as somebody who has data, not necessarily in a very structured way and in a data space, they have the local knowledge. And I think this is something that we would like to include. So next slide, please.
Thanks. Can you show the slides, please? On the
Just to
screen.
put it into context, the use case that we try to adapt to explore is one small to medium-sized Greek city, but with a very high number of vulnerable communities, either in the terms of economically vulnerable elderly people. There is an aging population in Greece, with and also people that have single-parent families, etc. So there is migrants. So there is all these people and all this knowledge and all these challenges that they face. We would like to introduce and bring it into light using all these elements about cross-domain interoperability. Next slide, please. And we want to address several different social challenges: energy poverty, either in the winter or in the summer. Summer energy poverty with urban heat island is a very big problem. There is several different challenges about what are the impacts of heat waves, how we can protect all this kind of population, how we can better allocate funds, help for the people. And this can be a very nice, I think, an applied service for the area. I have a slide afterwards that it's pretty much trying to summarize the presentation of Simon, and I would like to thank both Simon and Matti in a very difficult workshop we had in Athens, that without electricity and the fire alarm keeps, every kind of alarm was there with a heat wave and everybody was sweating. I hope you got a good reward afterwards with a nice lunch. But I think it set the basis to understand what is the situation, what kind of diversity there exists, what kind of diversity we want to reach in terms of data, and what kind of data, how we can capture all these forms of data. And in the next slide, which will be my final, so I don't want to trouble you into. So all these elements that we try to understand is, I think for us, they could be both an enabler, but also can be a restriction. So we need to understand, and this is what we do now for the different services that we try to do, to understand where each of the services stands in terms of organizational, technical, scientific, and trust, and whether, of course, considering the local context, this can be considered as an enabler, or it can be something that restricts the flow of data, the seamless flow of data. So this is, I think, this is something very interesting that we will continue to explore in the next period. That's why, next slide and closing, is that I would like to invite you to join the stakeholder forum that we have established within the Climate Adapt for EOS project and be part of this discussion that we are having, contribute. And I think there is a lot over these few days that I have watched the conference, there is a lot of similar context questions for everybody. So thank you very much, and we are here.
Thank you, Thanasis. So yes, that's excellent. Please do join the stakeholder forum, particularly those of you involved in climate adaptation projects and interested in that legal and organisational interoperability dimension. There will, of course, be other things discussed on that forum, but it'll be that merger of those technical, legal, organisational issues and the climate adaptation issues. I want to add to something that Thanasis said. Matti and I have been running workshops with each of the case studies we mentioned to run through these sort of questions. We also have a spreadsheet where we're going through the data sets in question, understanding what licenses attached to them, but then more specifically what specific conditions and obligations are involved. And as I said earlier, trying to map the exchanges of data which are necessary to understand the organisational dimensions. What Thanasis talked about was that we had a power cut during that workshop. So we did our best to continue the work despite the lack of electricity. We still had batteries on our computers, of course, and the fire alarm, which was going for about 90 minutes before we finally gave up. We still got a lot of very good work done. But these are the challenges of energy issues in midsummer in Athens. Okay, thank you very much, Thanasis. Next up is Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, I'm Rebecca Farrington. I work for AusScope, which is an Australian National Research Infrastructure Organisation. So thank you for the introductions about our space from the other speakers. We look after geoscience and geospatial research infrastructure, and I've been asked to talk about two different case studies that are relevant in this space. They kind of place, I suppose, a bit different lens than what others have spoken about. So the two cases are vertical integration of geophysical data sets across scales, and so that's a case for kind of like the federation of, I suppose, data systems, which we've spent quite a bit of time talking about in the last couple of years in Australia, as well as a sample metadata cascade from the collection event. So I'll step through that, I think, in a little bit more detail, but that's what we're talking about as a case to support implementing care via RAID, the Research Activity IDs that I was going to call you CSIRO, ARDC is setting up, and using local contexts, which is an international group based out of New York that helps to implement care principles where you can have, in our context, we can put notices on if on samples that have been taken from Indigenous lands, which is obviously very important in the Australian context. Okay, so AusScope, we do different things. For the cases I'm talking about, we funded geophysical instruments, magnetotelluric instruments, as well as the acquisition of the data, so the field work, but in collaboration with Geoscience Australia, as well as University of Adelaide. And this is the broader ecosystem that we operate in. So there's lots of different organisations. We partner with many universities, the State Geological Surveys, Geoscience Australia, a lot of other NCRIS organisations, the National Research Infrastructure Collaboration Scheme, as well as international geophysics and geochemistry organisations. So whether that's European infrastructures and US infrastructures, New Zealand, as well as One Geochemistry. I might just skip forward to go to this map, just to give you a bit of a better context. So this is the magnetotellurics site locations. It was called ODSLAMP, and this is a project that's still going ahead. We started off in 2017 acquiring the data, and we spent quite a bit of time in a subsequent project called Geophysics 2030, processing the data in reproducible formats, and also making sure, we had a lot of discussions about standards, and so making sure the different standards from different organisations is still a work in progress. So the example is that the data that was acquired by University of Adelaide and the AusScope funded portion is held in a different data standard template than for Geoscience Australia's portion. So that's not a technical problem, but that's just how we all, I suppose, operate, and we're all familiar with that kind of issue. But if we step back, what we did with the data was, it's currently located at NCI, with the raw data, but that's come from 3 different states, so 3 different state surveys technically have carriage of that data. We've got copies of it at NCI, but we've processed it through different processing levels, so from just measuring the electrodes in the ground right up to the end result that goes into a publication paper. And I suppose the case that I'm talking about here is the idea that the raw data needs to exist in a high-performance computing facility. It needs to exist there because it's of scale, and to process that requires quite significant processing. As we step along that pathway to more of the data products, we're starting to get to more, the visualization aspects are more important, which requires a different set of skills and different organisational requirements, right up to PDFs of maps that are available through organisations like Geoscience Australia on their website that you can access just by download. So I'm happy to chat about that at any time. We've spoken about that a couple of times, so please reach out if you'd like to know more. Oh, I didn't know this did this. Great. Yeah, so this is work. I've taken these slides directly from a presentation that Lesley did at AGU last year in work collaborating with Aaron Robinson. So the citation's down the bottom, and we put the presentation on Zenodo because there's quite a bit of detail that I can't go through today. So this is the idea that you have a collection event and you take something from the natural world and there's this massive cascade of data and processes, etc., that happen from that. And the details of that collection event can be lost at any time through that process. For Ozscope, we don't fund the actual collection of samples, but we fund instruments that analyse the samples, and we fund data platforms that holds the data that is derived from that. So we can often lose, like, I suppose, knowledge of that collection event. We do have, IGSNs and whatnot, so we can have a PID on the sample, but what happened during that collection event is generally can be lost to us. Oh, geez. Also, I suppose with geoscience research, people have been doing this for a very, very long time, right? And the data that people collected decades and decades ago is still in use today. So, yeah, which is where we step into Lesley's field work. So Lesley spent some time in the field throughout her career. And I suppose this is a different map than what we've seen in the previous slide that I talked about Ozscope in the context of, government organisations and universities. And this is the IATSIS map of Indigenous Australia. So as we can see, it's much more heterogeneous than any of the state boundaries or organisational boundaries. But on top of that, or adjacent to that, we have native title legislation. So parts of Australia have gone through the native title process, and that is traditional owners have that's their land, and that's been established. We also have a large swathe of the country that's under that process, so that process can take a very long time. And then also, I suppose, it's quite detailed legally, right? So, they can get native title or not, but that doesn't change the fact that people are from those locations. Anyways, sorry to rush through this. The presentation's there and I can talk more. There's other people that are obviously more qualified than myself to talk about this. I'm happy to point everyone in that direction. So the idea is that we can capture using research activity IDs at that collection event, and we can then also attach all of the information that's needed to identify what happened during that event. So that can be on different scales. We can put in a notice through local context to say this may have importance to Indigenous communities, and then, as we go through that process of reconciliation and discussions, that can be then dealt with by the appropriate communities. But we can also then go back in time. For example, with Lesley's work, there was processes in place at all the different organisations working at Indigenous communities throughout the decades, but the documentation isn't necessarily at standard for today, but it still exists. So there's lots of, landowner and community engagement documentation, whether that's names, whether that's specific communities, whether it's land councils, etc., that exists, and those are all the things that we can put in the research activity ID. That's very different than the data that we would have coming off the geochemistry instruments, but also that changes with time. So we're in an evolving space, and that will always continue to change. I think I've gone way over time. I'll stop. Geochemistry, the maps. As you can see, it's very complicated. RAID.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And I think the important point there that was made about that need for that retrospective historical work to understand what conditions relating to local context or to care it may be necessary to apply to that historical data. That's a huge challenge, but clearly something that we need to address. Kelsey, last but not least, Kelsey Drucken will end those set of presentations, and then we'll have a little bit of time for discussion.
Great, thanks Simon, and thanks everyone. I'll try to be short and sweet so that we can get to discussion. And I'd like to start out, my pitch here is that I'm going to give you some perspectives from a very open space. I'm from a national research infrastructure here in Australia. We help support the climate modeling software and data kind of ecosystem. And we, for the most part, especially compared to presentations here earlier, we don't have to worry about too much of the legal. We are in a very open science space, but we still have challenges that are very difficult when we talk about organizational interoperability. And the pitch, I think, to you is that climate data is inherently something you do want to combine, and it's very multidisciplinary. And we are very data hungry, and we want more and more high resolution. We want to get closer to the, the native simulation data because we want to look at more complicated stories. And if you've gone through all the trouble of your legal and organizational barriers from all the dimensions we've heard previously, and then you get to the open data space, it would be a pity to then have other additional barriers that we can help prevent or ease. So that's the take-home message here. So just very quickly to orient you, I'm talking about a space that is very HPC dominant. This is complicated software that's run on HPC. It produces very large output data. And you have to be on HPC essentially to analyze and combine with other data sets. We, like I said, are a national research infrastructure, so we look at all of that in the Australian context, but also for global information as well. So what I'd like to do real quick is walk through a few dimensions that to me are very key around organizational interoperability. And this is around the concept of open science, common platforms, scale, and collaboration. But I'd also like to talk about the strengths. Actually, in Thanasis, I loved the enablers. So actually, maybe enablers is a better term here. For us, in terms of open science, we work in a very open manner. Our licenses are pretty open. We work in open development platforms like GitHub. And that's really been a strength for us. We also, because the nature of requiring HPC, the community has had to move to common platforms many decades ago. So it's very, power hungry. And so that naturally creates common platforms where people are working together. And this is not only for running simulations, but also that analysis and future derivative product generation. And scale, again, because the community wants to create higher and higher resolution simulations of our planet, it has also created a common need for the community to come together because they have to get creative on how to scale up in their workflow. So that's been a strength of the community as a whole. And of course, collaboration. If we want to share data, that has, again, you can see a theme here. It's brought the community together to come up with ways to enable that federated sharing, the standards that go along with that so that you can effectively share and compare your data. So there's programs like the CMIP and ESGF activities here. So this has kind of set up the community over the last decade or two and has really helped overcome organizational interoperability barriers, but my pitch now is that those same dimensions still have challenges that we have to do better on. So just quickly from my perspective at Access, open science, while almost everything's open, there are still a few things that are not, and especially when you get into data or tools that come from the weather and operational aspects. So there are challenges to figure out how you come together in that open space when you do have government or operational considerations that require, legal agreements, and the governance and things that come around that. And just for a quick example, just in the Access NRI context here, just along the bottom, every little icon is a dimension, is a code base around our Earth system. You can see the different countries that these code bases come from, the number of developers. It's a people problem. There's lots of people working on the code. They come across the world. And so just the coordination of that presents challenges. Even though we're in an open space, the how we work is still a challenge. The common platform, while it has brought the community together, it still has complexities on how you get to that common platform. Porting code, copying data. Do you create the data on one platform and then copy it over to another? So again, you have to think through these things and have that coordination. And scale. We want to go bigger all the time. So while it's brought us together, we want to go bigger. And it is expensive. Compute and storage is not cheap. And when you're talking about the fundamental simulations that create other downstream products in the climate space, you have to think through how many copies of things you're going to hold, what are those use cases, who wants to share that, and where do you want to bring people together. AI is pushing this even further. And I just want to point out there's little to no support on the data publication side when you're talking about this scale. So, so that also, you have to think through that. And when you want to go and work with other people, is there a requirement that you're going to refer to published output in these other activities where you're bringing together climate data? So that's a huge challenge. And then lastly, while we've done so much, as I'm talking of the community of a whole, not just Access here, of course, and we have great programs for data sharing. Again, if you want to go back to the lower level products, if you will, or do activities that exceed just CMIP and the ESGF examples I talked about, those kind of activities are not set up in the same way. It takes huge amounts of effort to get to the CMIP and ESGF examples that I talked about in the bottom, but there's still everything else. So how do you kind of embed and prepare for those kind of federated and data sharing examples more generally? And so very quickly, we're working on, we're focusing as the software and data infrastructure to try and prepare for those things. So we're working on improving our standardization right from the start in our software. We have the luxury of kind of being on both ends. So we're doing a lot of work there. We want to make it basically, ready to go at a general level, straight when it comes off the code and you're on that common platform. And then also, it's really important for us to look at both the data and software workflows and understand all of the information you want to capture provenance-wise into, again, those workflows from the start. So that's just a quick little sample of things we're doing on some of these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, and to everyone. We've got about 15 minutes left for some discussion and observations. I'd like to open the floor to any questions. In particular, I'm keen to hear from anyone, whether a speaker or not, who identifies points of commonality or things that we might learn from the various speakers. While you're thinking about that, I'm going to list sort of what I think of some takeaways from the speakers, and I hope I do this with the intention of perhaps stimulating some thoughts or points in comparison. Kieran, the challenge there, I'm going to highlight one takeaway from each one, or one or two from each one. I'm not trying to reduce what they've said to just one point. But there, the real challenge was in aligning different legislative contexts, and our challenge to do that. And there's a very useful table of comparison, which could be the basis for understanding how that alignment might happen. From Adrian's, I took away the need for these clearly defined consent and sharing agreements. And that if we can get those semantics right, then we can start using those in different contexts, and that can help us a great deal. From Pascal, it was very much about agreements among the participants in a given project, and really overcoming some of the distrust or potential concerns. And really there, I think perhaps the term is proportionality. Persuading those partners to take a proportional approach to the risk. Hilde mentioned, I'm going to forget the name of the document, but it's really aligned processes around that core statistical processes document. And can you get organizations to align in that way? And I think we had something very similar from the last speaker, from Kelsey, in terms of organizational maturity against a number of criteria. Thanasis talked about the enablers and the work that they've been looking at, whether from an organizational or legal perspective. And Rebecca, the importance of having that metadata that allows us to drill back and to assign conditions perhaps which were ignored at the time of collecting. So hopefully that's a useful summary of key takeaways. Any questions or observations? There's, right, a whole load of hands have gone up. I think the first one I saw was light blue at the back, light blue arm. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks. Nina Welty, CSRO. This might be a very naive question, and apologies, but legal for whom? So are you looking at this from the perspective of like the researchers' side who are collecting and making sure that the research stays open and usable, or downstream implications in case of perverse outcomes that may come back to the institution that holds the data, or those who want access to the data? So, and perverse outcomes depending on which side of the question you're on.
Yeah.
So is this part of this work, or is that totally out of scope?
No, I mean, I think that is within scope. I mean, I can venture a response to that from my perspective, but I would, if any of the other speakers want to put their hands up and respond, please do. I mean, my answer to that is, what we're concerned about is legal interoperability. You know, so we've got to narrow our field there. What are the legal issues, whatever they may be, that prevent us from combining the data that we want to combine to produce the data product that we want to produce, yeah, or to do the research that we want. And those barriers are manifold, and they may include things about, you know, what could happen if, and they could include things about you cannot use this data unless under these conditions, etc., etc. You could model that, but above all, I mean, with the way we've been thinking perhaps reductively is, what are the barriers, what are the obligations, what are the enablers that allow us, the conditions under which we can use the data that allow us to do the work that we need to do. Does anyone want to add to that, or Kieran?
Thank you. Yeah, just to that part, adding to that one is, I think also the legal interoperability is not just the alignment part, but how do you navigate and understand the differences and what it means? So the same thing in one legal jurisdiction may need to be handled and dealt with in a different way. And how do you do that translation back and forth is probably one of the challenges in there as well.
Yeah. Could the people who raised their hands before raise them again? So, okay. So I think the first one I saw was a green T-shirt.
Hi, I'm Lars Eklund. I'm from the National Bioinformatics Sweden infrastructure. And I like to sort of continue that. Excellent answer, Kieran. I think that the question a lot of times becomes not legal for whom, but legal where. Because the legal context changes as we move globally. And for example, the example of agreements, the legal status of an agreement is different in different jurisdictions. So in some jurisdictions, an agreement is really strong legal document, and in some jurisdictions, an agreement is not even worth the paper it's written on. So it's very important, I think, to do the kind of crosswalks. And my question is, like, how do we solve this, figuring out this legal where question when we start moving data globally? At what stage is it the time to start looking at this?
Yeah. Do any of the speakers want to respond to that? Because I fear my response is reductive again, is that we've taken an approach, rightly or wrongly, that we're dealing with 3 specific case studies, and our task is to apply enablers to make those case studies work. Now that helps us in our immediate task, and it helps us understand some broader issues, but it doesn't help us do a mapping between conditions across different territories. Kieran had his hand up again, I think those.
I'm going to ask a question from the audience. How many of you in here have a legal background? What? You have one? Well, two. Well, there you go. And the reason was, I think we're not the people who can answer some of these questions. And the people who can actually think through these are probably definitely are missing from the dialogue. So I think that's one of the, we need to bring the legal people into the dialogue and trying to solve this from all of us, majority of us having an infrastructure or data background. Yeah, I think we need that voice in here.
I think Pascal might want to come in on that point and yeah.
Very briefly on that one. The legal aspects we talk about are relatively straightforward, but you need experts on it. I like to, again, from recent experience, point at probity from a public sector perspective. This is a very, very nasty problem to deal with. We talk about trust. If you want to have a trusted relationship to share data, you have to discuss with each other. Probity from public authorities, you can't do that. Otherwise, you can't have a contract later on.
Okay, and those, I think, yes. There's one of the people in the room with legal background.
Yeah, Christina Drummond, University of North Texas. I've had the privilege of working to build a data space over the last few years. And as we're talking about the trust and identifying the specifics, it took us 15 months to identify what those trust indicators were across our commercial public parties to have that common lexicon. And I appreciate the invitation here to think across. We worked in humanities scholarly communication, and I can see there are connection points that I think we could flush out through something like an RDA working group. But to the point around usage policy, having a controlled vocabulary on what those usage policy items are. So it's not where are you using the data, but it's how, and we have a common lexicon for the how options that could be permitted or excluded. And I think that having that kind of conversation across these efforts would be really helpful, especially if we want to interoperate across data spaces as organizations. So just an invitation there.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting. And that trust lexicon, is that published?
Yep, it's all in Zenodo. Everything we do is
Right.
open.
If you could share that information in the shared notes for the meeting, that would be fantastic.
There's a session at 1:30. I'll present.
Even better. Yes, please.
Joseph Gum, I'm with ESIP for the next 5.5 months, then I need a new job. As a part of, as the chair of the Sustainable Data Management Cluster, we did one meeting trying to start what bilateral agreements, contracts, MOUs might look like between repositories for data rescue. We know, that a lot of places are doing these sort of ad hoc contracts between, or agreements, or whatever you'd like to call them, between repositories in the US and different places outside the US. And maybe there's some talking that's going on between, say, the US, or not the US, but Australia, Germany, Norway, all these other places, but there's very little light, at least right now, about how these agreements are being made, and trying to come up with a sort of boilerplate agreement, not just around data rescue for right here, right now, but also for mirroring, replication, resilience going forward, about we will hold some of yours, you can hold some of ours, all of that. That is something we've been trying to do. I don't know if this is really a question or a comment, but if anyone would like to comment on it.
Any responses to that? Lauren had her hand up earlier as well, so perhaps you can ask your questions and comment and ask your question.
Yeah, so I would just give some feedback to what you're saying, which is So Duo is basically trying to build interoperability across consents through modular statements. And what we found in consent, and I would think it holds true for contracts in general, is that you cannot have like a template. You have to move forward with basically modular statement-based interoperability, because you just will not get agreement on a template. So I'll just hold that out for you. One thing I wanted to raise here, so last week I was at GA4GH and we're talking about interoperability, and one of the things that they raised is that they've developed this concept of data passport. So there's a researcher passport that GA4GH had developed previously. Now they have data passports, and the idea is to encode Duo or other flavors of Duo like DuckCCE, and also the policy piece. So encode this so that we can have machine actionable verification of, do we have consent to use this for this purpose, and then what are the policies in place. But what we have is a challenge of writing down what those policies are, and in addition to writing down the policies, how the policies are enacted in different spaces. So we really need to federate basically the documentation and a knowledge graph of what these policies look like, so we can get at the interoperability piece and the confluence and what policy is, I don't know, how different policies enact. So to that end, we have written a grant related to that, and I'm happy to talk about kind of different ways to encode that policy information, but I think this is a place where we could try to work together, and because we all have a shared problem, right? So trying to think about like shared approaches to doing this, building a policy knowledge graph, and also thinking about how policies are enacted and writing down basically what's not written down about policies.
Thank you. I like that idea of the passport. That speaks a little bit to Matti's dog chip. But I think it's also the characteristics of the data that allow them to be shared and reused, and understanding what that is. There have been a number of suggestions for ongoing conversations. There are some shared notes. I don't think we distributed those at the beginning of the session, which was our bad. But if you go to bit.ly, bit.ly/IDW-LOI, so bit.ly/IDW-LOI, there's the notes that we used to put together the session, and there's also in one of the tabs of the Google Doc, there's a tab called Participants. If you put your name and contact details in there, then I think we'd be very interested in continuing a discussion, not just among the presenters, but also with anyone who's interested. And there have been suggestions, perhaps an RDA interest group or something along those lines. We're very open to that sort of discussion. We certainly think there used to be a joint Co-Data RDA interest group on legal interoperability. That produced the report in 2016. It did some work on implementations and then sort of fizzled out a little bit. It may well be time to revive that and to see whether that can be a vehicle for comparison of issues across our various geographies. Rebecca.
Could you share that bit.ly link again, please, Simon?
Sorry? Yes, capitalized.
Thank you.
I can't put it on the screen, but it's bit.ly/ all in capitals IDW-LOI. That particular tab is an empty document, yeah.
Shall we commit to
Has that
putting
worked?
that?
bit.ly, so bit.ly/ capital letters IDW-LOI. So that last bit, IDW-LOI, is all in capitals because that's how I did it. And if we were more organized, we'd have done a QR code or something. But
we can put that file in the directory of the session later.
Yes.
That's what we can do.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's our time. So thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you very much for your engagement there. I think it's a good point to end on to take next steps, and we'll certainly consider that either for the next RDA plenary or for IDW, but we'll be in touch. Please put your contact details. And there was a QR code, which was the stakeholder forum for the Climate Adapt project. If you're interested in following that, please join that. So thank you to the speakers. Thank you very much to Lesley for helping us organise ourselves. Thank you for Rebecca for running the mic.